Hello, today we're going to talk about building your data management plan. My name is Erin Hoffman and I am the strategy and application lead at the Commons. I also run the support and customer success at FieldDoc. So, why am I qualified to give this presentation? Honestly, I don't know that I am. I feel like talking about how to manage data is a lot like trying to write a parenting book. If you raise a few kids, you might think, I can write a parenting book. I have worked with a lot of data for conservation organizations, and so I'm going to take a stab at walking you through some highlights that I think are relevant when you're putting together a data management plan. So today we're going to set the foundations for data stewardship, try to talk about what's your why to motivate you to spend the time to write this plan, and then build a plan. By the end of the training, I hope that you'll have the structure in place that helps you manage getting conservation and restoration data into FieldDoc and maintaining it over the life of your grant and beyond. I also think some of the tips that you'll get here can be applied in a more general sense. What is a data management plan? More or less, it's just a shared agreement. It's how you and all of the responsible parties are going to manage data as it relates to a certain goal and purpose. A data management plan is not a step-by-step manual on how to do something. Sometimes those are useful to have as well, and I like to think of those as a standard operating procedure document. Usually, if you try to put in place in stone how to do something, you're going to get tripped up. But if you have that plan and that guide that just says how we're going to do it, it's going to save you a lot of headaches down the road. So what are some of the foundations for data stewardship and why does it matter now? There's a growing prevalence of software options and requirements in the conservation sector. People are bombarding all of the on-the-ground restoration practitioners with requests for clean data about what they're doing. So having that quality defensible data is really important. Not only does it ensure that your restoration efforts don't just exist on the ground, it makes sure and it builds confidence in the data so that it can endure in your reports, in models, in putting them into funding cycles, and getting them placed in policy decisions. This stuff is really critical. So, what are some things that can really help with data stewardship and these management plans? When you have a management plan, you can operationalize your data management, make it part of your day-to-day at your organization, and it's going to improve the utility of the data and the strength of your staff. It's also going to build foundations for opportunity to scale use. Think of all those times that outside organizations and efforts are coming to you and asking for your data. If you have a good plan, it's easier to take advantage of those opportunities and take advantage of other software as it comes online. This is incredibly important when it comes to talking about utilization of AI as well. And finally, there's a historical trend in the nonprofit world that we're all doing a lot. We're all Jack and Janes of all trades. But I want to encourage you to embrace distributive data management strategies. And what I mean by that is let's share the work and let's share those tasks. You shouldn't have just one person on staff that knows how to manage a spreadsheet. So when you do these things and you have these foundations in place, you're able to submit stronger grant proposals. You're able to respond to funders and regulators with their questions with confidence. You're hopefully going to reduce that last minute work and scrambling around, which I think makes you vulnerable to errors. And it builds institutional memory that survives not just staff turnover, but organizational growth. So FieldDoc is a great example of a data management tool for conservation and restoration data. A lot of people think about it for reporting to their funders, but you can actually just maintain your conservation data in this system. It brings together a lot of disparate components and creates these really great records. And the goal using FieldDoc or any system, even if it's just a spreadsheet, is to manage data for long-term use, not just a one-off report. So think of it like planting a garden. You don't want to have to reinvent your garden every time you harvest. So what sort of data does FieldDoc manage? You've got your location data. So this is often your restoration footprint. And ideally, you're representing it with a point line or polygon, a geospatial data type. Then you have your activity. In FieldDoc, this can either be an open-ended field or it can be chosen from a controlled list. And those controlled lists allow you to do a lot more analysis across your entire portfolio. And finally, we have two types of impact metrics. We have those modeled metrics, which are pulling outputs based on the model that is run. Typically, this is sediment nutrient load reductions or carbon sequestration. And then we have those non-modeled metrics like trees, where you can just enter in your planned value and then your progress towards that. Okay, what's your why? Why are you going to spend the time putting together a data management plan? Even just watching this video, what is inspiring you? What made you say, oh my gosh, I need this? Here are some ideas of what your why might be if you're not coming up with it on your own. So are you planning or are you just meeting deadlines? Are you finding that your data is breaking under pressure? You log in, for example, to FieldDoc and it's just not what you remember doing and you're like, what do I do now? Are you fighting the software that you have to use? If you're fighting your software, you may not have a software problem. You may have a data problem. And do you feel like you've been doing this for so long that it's too late, that everything's in a giant knot or tangle or a bunch of weeds and it's too late to start? No, it's not. The best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago. Second best time is today. Same principle applies to data management planning. Okay, so you thought about why I'm doing this, why you're defending taking 2 hours to write your data management plan. Here are some other things to think about, like go get a cup of coffee and think about these different things. What is your scope? What data matters in this use case? You're going to start huge. You don't want everything under the sun to be collected in a data management plan. What is essential? Think about that. And then what are those external requirements that you know are going to shadow this data, whatever you do with it? What are the expectations that are really critical to influencing how you manage your data? And most importantly, how do you manage it today? What is working well? Lean into that. Lean into your strengths, but then also look at where the processes break down and create friction so that you can address those. I've got more rhetorical questions for you. Conventions and standards. Do you already use naming conventions in your file saving structure or how you're naming all of your restoration locations? Lean into those. Make sure it's documented. And then where does your source data live? Are you an organization that uses SharePoint or Google Drive? Are you saving everything on local drives, or do you have a network that you're able to all access? Think about that stuff. And then finally, where do you intend this data to go? And this is very open-ended and vague for a reason. Just think about it. Is it going to your grant funders, or are you sending it back to the on-the-ground participants to show them what their impact has been? Are you collaborating with regional efforts, international ones, all of that? Where do you want this data to go? Okay, so after you've gotten your coffee, you've thought through that stuff, just pull open a Word document and it's time to build your guide. We're really just going to walk through that process here. And you can pause it as you go if you want to type along, that's great. But we're just going to go through 9 sections. So I recommend just start by doing the obvious. Put the name and the publication details at the top of your document. Then you're going to just write down the purpose. I know it makes sense right now why you're doing it. The context is like staring you in the face, but in 6 months, your future self is going to thank you for writing down a purpose and goal in this document. So here's my main page for my organization, EcoSabers. I have created an entirely fictitious program that has a new data management plan. This is how much I like writing data management plans. So I have my organization author and the last updated date on the title page. And then I've put a little bit of effort into the purpose. And in the purpose, I've both identified what the program does and what its goals are and who the data that we will be collecting needs to be reported to. Awesome. So then we start to go a little bit deeper, and you'll notice throughout the plan we're kind of narrowing from the generalities into very specifics. So let's talk about that scope of the plan. What are you including in the plan and what are you excluding? And the other thing that I really like to name at the beginning of the planning process is your base record type. This is basically, that row in a spreadsheet. Like, what is that core unit that you are, basing everything off of? So we put the scope in here. In my fictitious data management plan, we are collecting restoration activity records, and those are our base record. There's going to be spatial data showing where the work occurred, and then implementation dates and basic extent information. We're also going to track the required funder metrics and those modeled outputs. We are not tracking in this spreadsheet those internal financial records, any personnel or HR data, or any of the planning concepts for things that were not implemented. Then let's go into the system and tools. So again, this might seem obvious today, but you'd be surprised, or I'm sure you all have horror stories about coming back to something after 6 months that you just put to paper or to digital paper and not remembering what you used. For example, how did I make my geospatial data? And this is also really important for staff turnover and growth. I like to do it in a table because I like tables. And again, we're stating the obvious. In this plan, we're storing all of our materials in a shared Google Drive. That source data is going to be managed in a Google spreadsheet, but we'll be creating our geospatial files using geojson.io because it's free and it's really simple. And then we're going to marry everything together in FieldDoc, and the FieldDoc is going to become our ledger of BMPs. Next, let's talk about who is doing what. List out everyone who will be involved and how they'll contribute. Why this is important is that it allows the systems to really be institutionalized and operationalized. There's less of a chance of data being dropped or missed, and there's less of a chance of that scramble at the end where there's, 5 Spider-Men pointing at each other to figure out who has to do the data entry. And what I've found is that often the person who can't say no is the person who ends up doing it if you don't use this sort of strategy. And the person who can't say no is either a person who doesn't actually have the time or a person who doesn't really know what's going on. So in this example, we have a lot of contributors. And again, it's a good reason to write this down. So we have the program manager who's going to oversee all of this and track the deadlines and make sure that everyone else is playing their role. Then we have field contractors. So again, completely hypothetical, fictional scenario, but these field contractors are going out and planting cover crops on an annual basis on participant farms. They're going to be the ones that are providing details back to the manager and coordinator about what was done. And the coordinator's job is going to actually be that data manager role. They're going to coordinate getting the information from the field contractors into the forms, doing reviews and making sure it all gets into FieldDoc. And then finally, we have here another person who is going to be touching this data, and that's a GIS contractor. That contractor is going to be building and maintaining an application that is reliant on the FieldDoc hosted data. And while that person isn't doing any of that data collection, they are really interested in making sure that there's quality data put into the final product of FieldDoc so that their application can stay relevant and up to date. Okay, so I started to talk about data collection. Do you see how we're going down into more specifics? So when you're talking about data collection, you're looking at sources, destination, storage, and content. Where is the data coming from is a great question. And this is an amazing example of how every data management plan is unique. I've talked to more organizations than I can count, and very few have exactly the same strategy for how they're getting data from anywhere and putting it into an authoritative source. So I liked this one organization I talked to who said that they were using invoices to track a lot of the data that they were entering into FieldDoc. So I kind of leaned into that scenario here. So here are all of the sources that we are collecting from. And then we say, where is it going? So we're Dave Matthewsing in this. And we're going to make sure that we're pointing all data into a Google Sheet as it is collected. I like to call this the touch it once scenario. So when you know you have information coming in, just throw it where it needs to be, and that will save you a lot of time. If you're feeling ambitious or comfortable in this data collection space, look into automations. Look into using Google Forms with Google Sheets or Airtable bases to start to get data to populate itself into where you need it to go. Storage is also great. I like to talk a lot about hunting things down and ways to avoid that, especially if you don't have a shared network and folks might be sharing stuff to their local drives. You want to make sure that you're emphasizing storing authoritative information in accessible places to everyone. And then content is what fields are you collecting? And we're going to get into this a little bit more as we look at the next section. And by the next section, I mean the one after this. So I kind of touched on data entry. This is the general steps of how data is created and moved through the pipeline and how it's going to reach its final destination. I, again, don't think you should write out step-by-step instructions. You might have staff that come up with great ideas, but as long as you tell them what the destination expectation is, I think for the most part your staff and you will be able to remember those general steps. This is a great place to put in a flowchart or a diagram that helps everyone do a quick review of how information moves from one place to another. And again, just make sure that everyone is aware of this process so that they can follow it. And check back. This is a great conversation piece to communicate with your entire team, check in, see if it's working, see if changes need to be made. Okay, so field names, this kind of goes back to that content of what are we collecting. Field names, it's a fancy word for labels in a lot of instances. Labels for those individual pieces of information in a data set. You're going to describe the data that's going to be stored in each field, and documenting and describing your field names, it's going to assist in mapping fields between systems and making sure that you have consistency over time. So the goal here is not to figure out exactly what the field names are in FieldDoc or in another third-party software system. The goal is to make sure that you have really clear naming conventions in your own spreadsheet. So the pathway of technology and modernization is integration between software systems. And there's this ideal scenario where one system can connect via an API to another system. And this is, the dream. It creates the opportunity for easy buttons and less manual work. In our sector, this is, we're not there yet for a lot of these different systems. And any chance you have to advocate for building these connections, like, please do that. The next best thing before our industry gets to having these direct connections is to allow for field mapping between source and destination files that allows for flexibility on the source file. And so this is the idea of, like, I'm sure you've uploaded a template somewhere where they say, okay, well, which field does this map to? And, that's a great middle ground to have before we can have these direct API connections. There are a lot of systems out there that can't map imports. And for those situations, you need to use the templates that's provided by that system. And that's fine. It takes a lot of manual data entry on your part, and it's probably kind of annoying. But if you have really strong naming conventions, at least you'll know really easily what you need to put where, and keep that consistency across every import. And I will say it is helpful if you know that you're going to be moving data from your source authoritative file to multiple templates. It's helpful to just keep a sheet that maps the names between the two systems. Okay, so here's my authoritative spreadsheet field name list where I write my names of the column headers and the description. And then I also have this for our data attribute table. Okay, so it's also important to think about file types. There are, especially with geospatial data, a lot of compatibility requirements that you need to follow depending on the system that you use. Now, there are universally accepted file saving structures, and ideally you're only working with systems that are following those structures. And so if you have contractors who work with geospatial data, they should be aware of those structures, and hopefully they're following those requirements. Unfortunately, not all third-party systems are utilizing those universal requirements. So make sure that you can get a hand on any geospatial data requirements early on in the process, so you can try and follow them. So I've written down here what our file types will be for each of our different critical files. And, if you have access to what the requirements are that you need to follow for different systems, such as the spatial data, you could throw those requirements in here too and just reference what they're important for, so that if you're sharing this with a contractor or someone new on your team, they're familiar with them. Okay, so then naming conventions. This is really important and something that I think gets overlooked more often than not. So my biggest recommendation is just to start simple and be consistent. And these naming conventions, they're really important in that source state, in that base unit, right? That base record type. So for example, if your base record is a BMP, you don't want every BMP to have that same name of, like, riparian buffer. You want to have a unique name associated with each one. And then you're also going to want to have simple, consistent naming conventions for anything that might be repeated over time. So, riparian forest buffer is a great example. If that is one of 4 BMPs that you're installing, you want to make sure that you're always entering it the same way, including the case of the text and the spelling. So I've put in here the different naming conventions within spreadsheets, and in the file types. So in the files themselves. So file saving, where there will be a lot of files coming in, you want to save them ideally in a specific way. And again, with the hunting, it just makes it easier to find what you're looking for and make sure that nothing's missing. Okay, so similar to naming conventions, you also are going to have some controlled vocabulary. So controlled vocabulary is basically when you're just picking from a list. It's really common in a lot of third-party systems to have controlled vocabulary. It's a really incredibly important part for analysis. But not every field needs a controlled vocabulary list. So you want to focus on fields that will be grouped, compared, or analyzed. Think extent units or activity types. You don't want it for those unique IDs, such as that base unit, or for free text fields. So here are some examples of controlled vocabulary. We have separated this into what at the organization we have for controlled vocabulary. And this for us will be the farms, those farm site codes, farmer field codes, and contractors. But then also grabbing the FieldDoc controlled vocabulary so that we can start to track that in our source data and be prepared for it in our import. Great. And so once you've gotten down to this like really specific part of what we're naming everything, and you put all your data together and it's time to move it along, don't forget that really important part, that really important step of reviewing and validating it. Honestly, I think this takes place throughout the management cycle. But you're just looking for errors, you're looking for consistency, and you're looking for, adherence to this data management plan that you've created. Awesome. So I've put in a few different areas here of where you would review and what you would look for. Now, again, this is a very generic time guide. Some other things that might be really handy for you and your team to add might include a timeline for when you're doing these different components and when data needs to be moved throughout that pipeline. And then if you really need it, step-by-step instructions for each component. And that's how you create a data management plan. And if you're excited and you're ready to go write yours, awesome. But if you still would rather avoid this step but see the value, the Commons is now this year offering new data concierge services that we can talk to you about. We are offering the service of direct FieldDoc data entry, where we literally just do the data entry for you. We'll hand you a template, you fill it out, and we'll get that into our system. We also can help you write your own custom data management plan and an SOP if you need that for your unique use case. And then if you just don't want to do data management at all, you can talk about outsourcing that to our team. Awesome. So this year, we are offering the direct FieldDoc data entry service to applicants for the SWIG and WILD RFPs for NIFWIF's Chesapeake Bay Stewardship Fund programs. You have to register to use this service. And registration will be closing March 1st. So please register and set up your first meeting now. It's anticipated to be about a 4-week turnaround period, and all final meetings will be taking place by March 26th. So we really hope to help you out. So register while you can secure a spot. And that is the conclusion of the data management plan overview. Really hope that you have gotten some nuggets here that you can apply to your system and your use. And we look to see that data coming into FieldDoc so that we can help get really clear digital records